Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of Cut Rate Commander, the series in which we take a look at low-price commanders and make budget decks with them. My name is Grazzet and today we'll be looking at Tolarian Academy's own mischievous Fae, Ivy Gleeful Spellthief. But before we continue, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you like this content and would like me to continue making more videos like this in the future. And if you're feeling particularly generous, please consider buying me a coffee at the link in the description to keep me caffeinated as I work on more of these builds. Also, be sure to stick around until the end of the video to see who won last week's poll and what commanders you'll be voting for an upcoming episode. So, with that out of the way, let's start by taking a look at the commander and playstyle. Ivy Gleeful Spellthief is a 2/1 fairy rogue with flying that costs a green and a blue and has the following ability. Whenever a player casts a spell that targets only a single creature other than Ivy Gleeful Spellthief, we may copy that spell. The copy targets Ivy. Breaking down her core stats, Ivy possesses a very low-to-the-ground CMC, a typically low but evasive stat block that matches her cost, and an ability that lets us get 2-for-1 value out of every spell we cast that targets our creatures, in addition to letting us snag copies of our opponent's targeted spells as well. Breaking down this ability further, at surface level it serves as a spectacular way for us to double up on the spells we cast that target our own creatures, whether those be auras to get a token copy of them on Ivy or targeted instants and sorceries to effectively cast them twice for double the benefit. But as we dig deeper into this ability, it becomes evident that other, less common mechanics can be used with it to get extra benefits as well, such as mutate creatures who will be able to double up on their mutate triggers, and bestow creatures for the extra aura first and extra body later. And that's just considering the spells we play, since Ivy, as her name suggests, is more than capable of grabbing copies of our opponent's single target spells for herself as well, easily helping herself to any single target buffs our opponent's creatures would benefit from. So, as we can see, Ivy is a spell copying machine, allowing us to suit her up with all manner of buffs right alongside our other creatures while occasionally copying buffs from our opponent's creatures. And in order to get maximum value out of this ability, we'll be loading our deck chock full of targeting effects for Ivy to get her thieving little hands on. Of course, that means we'll be running the standard auras you'd expect to see, ranging from buffs and sources of protection to allow our creatures and in turn Ivy to grow and be protected from removal, but we'll be focusing heavily on mutate creatures as well, who in the early game serve as bodies for us to start buffing up alongside Ivy, and later can be used to buff up our creatures while proccing their mutate triggers in the process. And while on the subject of creatures, we'll need to make sure we have plenty of cheap but resilient creatures to use as bases for our auras and mutations to avoid getting 2-for-1'd. So we'll be running plenty of low CMC creatures with hexproof, regeneration, and even indestructible that can hit the board relatively early to get buffed up right alongside our commander as quickly as possible. Now with that covered, let's let this Fairy Vandel loose against our opponents. As many a Tolarian mage will tell you, underestimating Ivy is a mistake you only make once, as her title of Spellthief is quite well earned, snatching spells away from right under the noses of students and staff alike. And now, with a fresh batch of planeswalking mages before her, she'll be more than happy to give a demonstration of her skills, all the while giggling at their misfortune for being on the receiving end of it. So, now that we know a bit more about the commander and playstyle, let's start looking at the deck itself by starting with the creatures. Starting in the CMC 1 slot, we open with Slippery Boggle and Gladecover Scout, both of which are 1/1s with hexproof, making them ideal early drops who are cheap enough to get on board quickly alongside Ivy, and whose built-in targeted removal protection gives us a safe base to load up with auras or mutate onto without fear of them getting removed while we do so. We then close out this slot with Errant Street Artist, a 0/3 with Flash Defender and Haste that we can pay 1 a blue and tap to copy target spell we control that wasn't cast, allowing us to choose new targets for the copy, serving as a cheap way to get a third copy of the best spell Ivy copies for us turn after turn. It's then on to the CMC 2 slot and some more cheap and resilient creatures in the form of Silhana Ledgewalker, River Boa, and Mire Boa. Silhana Ledgewalker is a 1/1 with hexproof that can't be blocked except by creatures with flying. Its combination of built-in targeted removal protection and evasion in the form of pseudo-flying making it another resilient base to load up with buffs that can also reliably get in for damage. River Boa and Mire Boa are both 2/1s we can regenerate for a green, the former also having Island Walk while the latter has Swamp Walk instead. Like previous entrants, possessing both cheap protection and evasion to make them difficult to remove threats once they've been loaded up with auras and mutations. We then have a pair of creatures that care about being targeted, with Spellwild Alf and Stormchaser Drake. Spellwild Alf is a 1/3 that reduces the cost of spells that target it by 2, making it a double-edged sword whose ability makes it far easier for our opponents to remove it, but its significant cost reduction for our bigger auras and mutate creatures still making it very much worth running, especially once we've granted it hexproof to prevent it from being targeted by our opponents at all. Stormchaser Drake is a 2/1 flyer that, whenever it becomes a target of a spell we control, draws us a card, fitting very well with our deck's game plan by providing a continual source of card advantage every time we enchant or mutate onto it. And lastly, we have Sakura Tribelder closing out this lot, a 1/1 we can sack to put a basic land from our deck into play tapped, primarily serving as a cheap source of reliable land ramp in our build, but, in a pinch, still being usable as a target for our auras or mutate creatures if we'd rather double up on them instead of ramping. The CMC 3 slot then brings us our final pair of resilient bodies with Darksteel Mirror and Troll Ascetic, the former being a 0/1 with Indestructible and the latter being a 3/2 with Hexproof that we can regenerate for 1 in a green, making them our hardest to remove creatures yet and thus superb targets for our auras and mutations. Triton Fortune Hunter will then be added in as another creature to target with our effects, being a 2/2 that, whenever we cast a spell that targets it, draws us a card, like Stormchaser Drake before it, providing us with a steady stream of card advantage as we continuously load it up with buffs. Then closing out this lot, we have a trio of mutate creatures with Glowstone Recluse, Sea Dasher Octopus, and Trumpeting Gnar. Glowstone Recluse is a 2/3 with Reach and Mutate for 3 in a green that, whenever it mutates, gains 2 +1/+1 counters. It's relatively low CMC, making it a reasonable to cast body to begin targeting with our effects in the early game, and later it's Mutate allowing us to quickly buff up the creature we attach it to and our commander, especially if we can chain mutates one after another. Sea Dasher Octopus is a 2/2 with Flash and Mutate for 1 in a blue that has, whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player, draw a card, serving as a reliable instant speed way to turn our buffed up creature/commander pair into repeatable sources of card advantage as they swing in. Trumpeting Gnar is a 3/3 with Mutate for 3 and 2 hybrid Simic that, whenever it mutates, creates a 3/3 beast creature token. Its token generation helping us shore up the deck's biggest weakness of having a relatively low board presence, enabling us to get extra bodies on board to screen attacks for us or edict removal effects that would otherwise bypass our creature's defenses. Proceeding to the CMC 4 slot, we open with Gnarlback Rhino, a 4/4 trampler that, whenever we cast a spell that targets it, draws us a card, making it the last and biggest of the creatures that draw us cards as we target them, and, like its smaller brethren, ensuring we can keep digging through our deck for resources as we buff both it and our commander. It's then back onto the Mutate plan as we close out this slot with Migratory Greathorn, Parcel Beast, and a Gemraiser. Migratory Greathorn is a 3/4 with Mutate for 2 in a green that, whenever it mutates, puts a basic land from our deck into play tapped. Its relatively low mutate cost making it a great way to buff up our smaller creature stat blocks, while its repeatable land-based ramp will help us speed up our mana base considerably as we continue to mutate onto it. Parcel Beast is a 2/4 with Mutate for a green and a blue that we can pay 1 and tap to look at the top card of our deck, putting it into play if it's a land or into our hand if it's not. Again, its dirt cheap mana cost providing our smaller creatures with a good defensive stat boost, and its cheap ramp/draw effect allowing us to dig deeper into our deck for more spells while simultaneously getting the mana we need to cast them. Gemraiser is a 4/4 trampler with Reach and Mutate for 1 in double green that, whenever it mutates, destroys target artifact or enchantment an opponent controls, giving us a great way to pick apart our opponent's back row as we continue to mutate onto it, which gets even better with the second copy created by Ivy to double up on that removal. Closing in on the end now, the CMC 5 slot is mutants all the way down, starting with Dreamtail Heron, Pouncing Shore Shark, and Souvenir Snatcher. Dreamtail Heron is a 3/4 flyer with Mutate for 3 and a blue that, whenever it mutates, draws us a card, serving as a decent mutate payoff in the form of card advantage as well as a way to make its mutate target evasive, which will go a long way to ensure it can more reliably get in for damage. Pouncing Shore Shark is a 4/3 with Flash and Mutate for 3 and a blue that, whenever it mutates, bounces target creature an opponent controls to their hand, making it a decent source of flash speed spot removal that works well with our mutate and targeted spell game plan. Souvenir Snatcher is a 4/4 flyer with Mutate for 5 and a blue that, whenever it mutates, lets us gain control of target non-creature artifact. Its hefty mutate cost being well worth it by providing us with a permanent means to steal away our opponent's rocks and utility artifacts, which again we can double up on thanks to our commander, as well as yet another means to grant our creatures evasion to allow them to more easily get through in combat. Then closing out this slot, we have Auspicious Strix, a 6/6 with mutate for 5 and a green that, whenever it mutates, exiles cards from our deck until we exile X permanents, where X is equal to the number of times that it's mutated, putting those permanents onto the battlefield. Its enormous base stats immediately turning whatever it mutates onto into a sizable threat, and the free spells it provides as it mutates, taking full advantage of our permanent heavy build to grow our board and buff up our creatures even further. And finally, reaching the CMC 6 slot and our last creature, we have Sawtusk Demolisher, a 6/6 trampler with mutate for 3 and a green that, whenever it mutates, destroys target non-creature permanent and gives its controller a 3/3 to replace it. Again, its massive stat block giving its mutate target a sizable stat boost, and its repeatable Beast Within-like effect, despite being limited to non-creatures, is still spectacular spot removal that handily deals with a wide variety of threats. That covers all our creatures, so let's move on to our instance. The first half of the CMC1 slot brings a Slip Out the Back and Tamiyo Safekeeping, the former giving target creature a +1/+1 counter and phasing it out, while the latter gives target creature hexproof and indestructible instead until end of turn, while also gaining us 2 life, making them both cheap and reliable means to protect our commander and the creature we're building up alongside her from all manner of removal and wipes. The latter half of this slot then gives us Shadow Rift and Slip Through Space, both of which draw us a card, with the former granting target creature Shadow until end of turn and the latter making it unblockable until end of turn instead, each providing our augmented creatures with very solid evasion to get in for damage, while also, thanks to Ivy, drawing us 2 cards instead of 1 in the process. It's then on to the CMC2 slot and our counterspell suite consisting of Counterspell, Arcane Denial, and Negate, all of which counter target spell, the first countering anything, the second also countering anything but having the countered spell's controller draw 2 while we draw 1 on the next upkeep, and the last being limited to non-creature spells, all of which provide our build with some solid disruption to help impede our opponent's attempts to hamper our game plans or progress their own. And finally, reaching the CMC3 slot and our last instance, we have Beast Within, which destroys target permanent and gives its controller a 3/3 to replace it, which of course makes its way onto our list as a very flexible removal option that's capable of dealing with a wide variety of permanent threats. That covers all our instance, so let's move on to our sorceries. This category is going to be ramp all the way down, with the CMC2 slot bringing us Rampant Growth, Farseek, and Nature's Lore. The first putting a basic land from our deck into play tapped, the second putting a land with a non-forest basic land type into play tapped instead, and the last putting a forest from our deck into play, all serving as cheap and reliable land-based ramp to help speed up our mana base. Then Cultivate and Kodama's Reach close out our sorceries as we reach the CMC3 slot, both of which let us search our deck for 2 basic lands, putting one into play tapped and the other into our hand, providing us with even more staple ramp to ensure we can outpace our opponent's mana base and make our land drops for later. That covers all our sorceries, so let's move on to our enchantments. Starting off in the CMC1 slot, we have a trio of card advantage auras in the form of Curiosity, Keen Sense, and Combat Research, all of which draw us a card whenever the enchanted creature deals damage to a player, the first 2 proccing off any type of damage, while the last only procs off combat damage but does give any legendary creatures it enchants +1/+1 and ward 1 to make up for it. All 3 turning our empowered creatures and commander into reliable sources of repeatable card draw, especially when considering the sheer amount of trample and evasion our build has at its disposal. We then close out this slot with another 3 auras, those being Aqueous Form, One with Nature, and Rancor. Aqueous Form makes the enchanted creature unblockable and, whenever it attacks, has its scry 1, easily allowing our beefed up creatures to get in for damage while netting us some card selection in the process. One with Nature lets us, whenever the enchanted creature deals combat damage to a player, put a basic land from our deck into play tapped, giving our build a repeatable form of damage-based land ramp that our empowered creatures can easily use to rapidly build up our mana base. Rancor gives the enchanted creature +2/+0 and a trample, and when Rancor sent to the grave from play, it returns to our hand, making it a cheap trample granter with offensive stat boost attached that we can easily recur again if the enchanted creature is dealt with. The CMC2 slot then starts us off with a pair of protection auras in the form of Alpha Authority and Canopy Cover, both of which effectively grant the enchanted creature hexproof, the former also preventing it from being blocked by more than one creature and the latter making the creature only blockable by creatures that have either flying or reach, both providing our creatures and commander with excellent spot removal protection and adding in some evasion to boot. Eel Umbra then joins us as another defensive aura, it having Flash, Totem Armor, and granting the enchanted creature +1/+1, allowing us to either cast it normally for the stat increase or flash it in response to destruction to keep our creature and by extension our commander alive. It's then on to some cantripping auras as we delve deeper into this slot with Setessan Training, Rune of Might, and Cartouche of Knowledge, all of which draw us a card when they ETB, the first granting the enchanted creature +1/+0 and trample, the second granting it +1/+1 and trample, and the last granting it +1/+1 and flying. Each synergizing spectacularly with Ivy to draw us 2 as they become copied, and their keyword granting and stat increases allowing us to grow our creatures even further. Some ramping auras then get added to our arsenal with Karametra's Favor and Ordeal of Nylea. Karametra's Favor draws us a card when it ETBs and also lets us tap the enchanted creature for a mana of any color, this time turning Ivy and a creature of our choice into mana dorks to help us get out our bigger spells faster, all while +1ing us in the process. Ordeal of Nylea, whenever the enchanted creature attacks, puts a +1/+1 counter on it, and then, once it has 3 or more, sacks itself to put 2 basic lands from our deck into play tapped, serving as a passive way to grow our creatures as they swing in that eventually turns into some solid land-based ramp for us. And lastly, we have our only non-aura in this slot, Season of Growth, which, whenever a creature ETBs under our control, lets us scry 1, and whenever we cast a spell that targets a creature we control, draws us a card, effectively turning all our creatures into targeted spell payoffs that help us keep our hands nice and full while we continue to enchant and mutate them. Now entering the CMC3 slot, we have a pair of defensive auras starting us off with Shielding Plaques and Snake Umbra. Shielding Plaques gives the enchanted creature hexproof and, when it ETBs, draws us a card, providing us with yet another source of targeted removal protection to help keep our tall creatures alive, with the added bonus of not only replacing itself but actually netting us a card thanks to Ivy. Snake Umbra has Totem Armor, grants the enchanted creature +1/+1, and, whenever it deals combat damage to an opponent, draws us a card, giving us another set of Totem Armor to help protect our creatures from removal that, in the meantime, provides repeatable card advantage and a stat increase. We then close out this slot with another trio of auras, those being Cartouche of Strength, Hydra's Growth, and Ancestral Mask. Cartouche of Strength, when it ETBs, lets the enchanted creature fight target creature an opponent controls, as well as granting it +1/+1 and trample, allowing us to weaponize our beefed up creature's stat blocks and even granting them a way to crash through blockers and a stat boost as a bonus. Hydra's Growth, when it ETBs, puts a +1/+1 counter on the enchanted creature and, on our upkeep, doubles the amount of +1/+1 counters on it, taking full advantage of our hard to interact with creatures by turning them into an ever-growing threat that gets exponentially bigger turn after turn. Ancestral Mask grants the enchanted creature +2/+2 for each other enchantment in play, instantly turning any creature we enchanted with into a massive beatstick thanks to both the amount of auras we're running and the copies of them that our commander creates. Closing in on the end now, the CMC4 slot stays on the Aura game plan by adding in Auramancer's Guise, Bear Umbra, and Gaia's Embrace. Auramancer's Guise grants the enchanted creature Vigilance and +2/+2 for each aura attached to it, making it a powerful aura payoff that grows the enchanted creature and by extension our commander massively, while also allowing us to keep it untapped to protect ourselves from our opponent's retaliation. Bear Umbra has Totem Armor, grants the enchanted creature +2/+2, and, whenever it attacks, untaps all lands we control, providing us with an insane amount of ramp by untapping our entire land base with every swing, while also tacking on a decent stat boost and source of protection to boot. Gaia's Embrace grants the enchanted creature +3/+3, trample, and lets us regenerate it for a green, simultaneously providing its target with a big stat increase, the ability to crash through blockers, and a cheap repeatable source of protection, all in a single package. We then close out the CMC4 slot with a non-aura, the Phasing of Zhalfir, a saga with Read Ahead, whose first 2 chapters phase out another non-land permanent for as long as we control it, and whose last chapter destroys all creatures, giving their owners 2/2s to replace them, which will be primarily running as a 4-mana wipe in our colors that leaves our opponents with a board full of vanilla bears that our creatures should easily be able to get over, and that our creatures generally won't succumb to thanks to the prevalence of regeneration and totem armor in our build. And finally, reaching the CMC5 slot and our last 2 auras, we have Octopus Umbra and Verdant Embrace. Octopus Umbra has Totem Armor, turns the enchanted creature into a base 8/8, and, whenever it attacks, lets us tap down target creature of power 8 or less, usually providing the enchanted creature with a huge stat bump and granting it a way to prevent any large or annoying creatures from intercepting our attacks, while also giving it a source of one-time protection in a pinch. Verdant Embrace gives the enchanted creature +3/+3 and, on each upkeep, creates a 1/1 token, making it good enough on its own to both pump a creature and get extra bodies on board, but really shining when our commander makes a copy of it to allow us to flood the board with 8 bodies per rotation for us to take advantage of. That covers all our enchantments, so let's move on to our artifacts. Our singular artifact entrant joins us in the CMC 3 slot, that being Twinning Staff, which, if we would copy a spell 1 or more times, copies that spell an additional time and lets us choose new targets for the copy, as well as letting us pay 7 and tap it to copy an instant or sorcery we control, which in our case will be running exclusively for its passive, allowing Ivy to create 2 free copies of each targeted spell either we or our opponents cast for even more value. That covers our lone artifact, and with no planeswalkers in this build, let's move straight to our land base. Starting off with our mana lands, we have Command Tower, which taps for any color in our commander's color identity, Dreamroot Cascade and Hinterland Harbor, both of which come into play tapped unless we control 2+ other lands or a forest or island respectively and tap for either of our colors, Vine Glimmer Snarl, which comes into play tapped unless we reveal an island or forest and taps for either of our colors, Yavimaya Coast, which taps for either a colorless or instead either of our colors if we take a damage, Flooded Grove, which either taps for a colorless or any combination of 2 of our colors if we pay a blue or a green, Rimewood Falls and Tangled Islet, both of which come into play tapped, tap for either of our colors and are both considered an island and a forest, Temple of Mystery, which comes into play tapped, taps for either of our colors and scries 1 when it ETBs, and finally Evolving Wilds and Terramorphic Expanse, both of which we can tap and sack to put a basic land from our deck into play tapped. Then moving on to our utility lands, we only have a single entrant with Scavenger Grounds, which taps for a colorless and we can pay 2, tap it and sack it to exile all cards from all graveyards, giving us a reliable way to combat against graveyard heavy builds from our land slot. And lastly, we're running 11 islands and 12 forests as our basics to close out our land base. So, now that we've covered all the cards in the deck, let's take a look at this deck's breakdown. This deck currently has 25 creatures including the commander, 7 instants, 6 sorceries, 26 enchantments, 1 artifact, 0 planeswalkers, and 35 lands. Looking at the stats that matter to our game plan, we have 24 auras, 11 creatures that mutate, 4 other spells that target our creatures, 6 cards that care about targeting, 9 sources of protection, 7 creatures with built-in protection, and 2 cards that care about spells being copied, providing us with a massive amount of targeting spells that Ivy can copy for us, a decent number of payoffs as we cast those spells, a good number of hard to interact with bodies to buff up along with even more ways to keep them protected, and even a handful of ways to get some extra mileage out of the copies that our commander creates. For general deck stats, we have 12 ramp sources, 12 card draw sources, 9 targeted removal sources, and 1 board wipe. Our targeted removal and wipes being slightly lower than normal since we're dedicating more of our build to keeping our creatures alive instead of destroying our opponents, with our ramp and draw falling within more typical ratios. Looking at our mana curve, we have 13 1-drops, 22 2-drops, 15 3-drops, 8 4-drops, 6 5-drops, and 1 6-drop, leaving us with a fairly aggressive curve that aims to get a creature on board quickly, then followed by our commander, and then loading them both up with all manners of auras and mutations to both help keep them alive and able to tear apart our opponent's life totals. This deck is currently valued at $64.35, not counting the price of basic lands or shipping. This price was calculated by using the cheapest listed marketplace price on TCG Player at the time of this recording. For side grades, Cetessan Champion, Eidolon of Blossoms, and Verdurian Enchantress may warrant consideration if we'd rather lean more into enchantments for the excellent draw they provide, while Artisan of Forms, Arencius' Vile Duplication, and Double Major are superb ways to copy our entire mutation stacks via a single card, with the latter two even getting us extra non-legendary copies of our commander. For upgrades, Sage of Hours is an excellent target for our spells that will eventually pay off in the form of extra turns. Vesuvian Duplimancy makes for an incredibly powerful addition that gets us extra non-legendary copies of our commander, who in turn will get us even more copies of our targeted spells, with the same going for Spark Double and Sakashima of 1,000 Faces, both of which come in as non-legendary copies of Ivy to get even more copies of her into play, and Eldrazi Conscription being the be-all end-all of auras that will serve as a powerful top end to annihilate both our opponent's boards and their life totals. And finally, if we have the cash to burn, we can always add in the generically good Mana Drain, Cyclonic Rift, and Fierce Guardianship to beef up our Disruption suite. Though despite them all being blue, our accounts are certainly going to be in the red if we want to acquire them. Thanks everyone for sticking around until the end of the video. Again, before we continue, I'd like to take a moment to thank the channel subscribers for helping us not only reach the 6.8k sub mark, but also crack the 6.9k milestone. Thank you all for your continued support, as this channel would be unable to grow without it. Then taking a look at the results of last week's poll, it looks like the majority of the voters decided to hire Ramsey's Assassin Lord for this contract. So look forward to an assassin-themed build featuring him next week. Moving on to this week's poll, we have a lineup of black-infused legendaries this time around, with our contenders being the spell-slinging Rakdos Burner Torwaku the Younger, the life-siphoning Orzhov Vampire Varrock Warped Singier, and the mono-black sacker back from the dead Braid's Arisen Nightmare. Please cast your vote in the community tab, link in the description, and let me know in the comments who you voted for and what commanders you want to see from Dominaria United in future polls. And before we close out, again, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't done so already, as this channel cannot grow without your support. And if you feel like showing your thanks by keeping me caffeinated while I make these videos, please consider buying me a coffee at the link in the description. And speaking of which, I'd like to thank David Embler for their generous donation. Thanks for the coffee, David, and thanks for supporting the channel. And if any of you would like to support the channel in a different way, feel free to check out the other deck techs floating around my head if you'd like to see the latest builds, or click on the link above for a playlist of all the Cut Rate Commander episodes I've made so far. And with that, have a good one folks, and stay safe.